Let me introduce today's speaker. Zita Tóth has received her PhD at Fordham, and she is now a postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven, working on a project concerning hylomorphism in the medieval ages. Am I right, Zita?
Yes, that's correct.
And today she is going to talk about an embarrassing relative. Zita, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you especially Tamás and Dani for inviting me. So, well, I want to say that when I was first asked about this topic, I thought, well, I have nothing to say about this, because somehow, interestingly, usually medievalists who work on causation, I did work on causation quite a bit, but we rarely discuss teleology. And I started to wonder about this, why that's the case. And I think, you know, there are a few reasons why that's the case. There is the very sort of obvious pragmatic reason. I mean, it's quite an obscure thing to do medieval philosophy to start with, but if you start talking about teleology to people, well, that just makes it worse. So it's kind of like an embarrassing relative. You know it's there, but you just try not to think about it or talk about it. I think there's a more intrinsic reason, which has to do with sort of the fact that even medieval authors were usually pretty skeptical, at least starting from Duns Scotus in the 14th century, were pretty skeptical about final causation, and I will return to that point a little bit later. But they often declare it a mistake to consider final causes, especially when one is doing natural philosophy or metaphysics. Again, we can discuss that a little bit later. And the third point is that, of course, the notion of efficient causation and final causation seem to be at least prima facie independent. So one would think that you can study one without the other. And it's really this last point that I want to sort of question in this talk. And basically, I want to show that teleology at least may be helpful to deal with a problem that this powers ontology faces. So before turning to that problem, I just want to say a very few words about the general methodology here. So I am a historian of philosophy, so I will be mentioning some names occasionally, but it really doesn't matter if people don't know these names or these authors. That's really not the point here. I just I like presenting views sort of tied to specific people, because otherwise it may seem like I just made them up. So, all right, so let's start with the problem. And I just, I wanted to show this quote by Buridan, 14th century, who says that it seems to me that everyone by a natural impulse and by nature accepts that the end is a cause of our operations. So if you ask an old woman, for instance, for what reason she goes to the church or to the market, she will tell you that in order to hear mass or to buy a tunic. The difficulty is only to see how that which nothing can be a cause of those things that exist. So the conclusion of Buridan at the end of the question is that, well, we should not discuss final causes when we do metaphysics or natural philosophy. So, all right, but let's turn to the problem I wanted to present here. So the problem of fit is, I think Neil Williams called it like this for the first time, but I don't quote me on that. It originates in the early modern period, probably from Pierre Boyle, and concerns how it could be the case that active and passive powers, understood as internal properties of objects, just happen to fit together. The problem has been raised again against contemporary Aristotelian views of powers. Again, Neil Williams and Walter Tóth are, I think, the main proponents of this problem or the puzzle. And what Tóth says, for instance, in a recent paper, or asks rather in a recent paper, is that why does the power of fire to burn paper never run across paper with the power to turn into a chicken when encountering fire? Or as he says later, that powers fit in the way they do looks very much like a miracle. So the problem, both in Tóth's and in Williams's version, is generated once we accept a few conditions about causal powers. And I think these conditions are pretty widely accepted among Neo-Aristotelians, but also among most, among medieval Aristotelians as well, and probably by Aristotle, at least prima facie. So the first condition is that powers are independent. In other words, that they can exist without their manifestations. So, fire has the heating power, even if it's not actually heating anything. The second condition is that powers are intrinsic properties. So in other words, once we fix the intrinsic properties of things, then we automatically have the powers. The third condition is that powers and their manifestations are essentially linked. In other words, it pertains to the essence of a heating power to actually heat. And finally, fourth, that powers, so to say, come in bundles. Active and passive powers are reciprocal. So this is Ott's categorization of these conditions. I think Williams lists 3 of them, but he bundles the first 2 of them together. It doesn't really matter for the present purpose. So as they suggest, if we accept these assumptions, the fact that powers fit should be just as surprising as some random pieces of puzzle made by separate people without any way of coordination, or without having a master plan, giving us a coherent picture. So obviously what would happen in that case is that we find a lot of unfitting pieces. And so the question is, why don't we find a lot of unfitting or only unfitting pieces in the case of active and passive powers? So I think there are a few things that are interesting in this problem. I wanted to read one more thing from Williams, because I think it really illustrates the core of the issue. So imagine a rock with the power to smash a particular glass. The powers of the rock are such that when they encounter the glass, they would shatter the glass. But also imagine that the glass's powers are such that that the glass would just emit a ping sound when it's met with a rock. And so the question is, of course, what happens in this case when the 2 of them meet? Williams thinks that this is an incomprehensible scenario. So he thinks that the fit, it's not even enough that powers fit, but they have to fit necessarily. So this is not even a possible world in which such a scenario could happen. So I think we get the issue here. And of course, if we think about not just powers like these, but also background conditions, which are also sometimes considered as powers, then we end up with all kinds of powers that have to fit together. For instance, when fire burns water, right? There is the power of the air to support, or the power of the oxygen to make the fire possible, and so on. So it becomes quite a messy picture. So what can we say? So one thing we can say is what Walter Ott says, namely that we have to give up powers as intrinsic properties. So he thinks that sort of in the Lockean vein, that powers are purely relational. Williams thinks that maybe some kind of power holism can help with this issue. I don't think these are very promising for the Aristotelian, for the reason that I think Aristotle arguably holds that powers have to be at least grounded in intrinsic features. And although there were maybe a couple of thinkers in the medieval period who thought about powers as pure relations, it was not a very popular view, and there were all kinds of theological reasons why it was not a popular view. We don't really need to get into it. So what can one say if one doesn't want to say these things? I think there are a few other routes that one can take. So you can say maybe that there are no passive powers, and so just eliminate sort of the passive power dimension of this picture altogether. This unfortunately also won't really do for us, because medieval authors really take passive powers to be explanatorily necessary. And again, I'm going to return to this a little bit later. I mean, the basic conviction is that, you know, undergoing action is not the same as doing an action. So if we equate active and passive powers, then this absurd conclusion or consequence would follow. There were also various theological cases that were, I mean, I find this interesting because they really test how our theories can be applied in various possible world scenarios. So one of them is the what they call the problem of impassibility. So things after the resurrection, or especially human bodies after the resurrection, won't undergo that kind of suffering that they undergo right now. And most theologians, at least in the 13th century, explain that by referring to the things having different passive powers. Anyway, theological questions aside, I think there is also a way, and I have argued for this earlier, to point out that at least for most medieval people, and I think arguably for Aristotle too, there is a special kind of causation where the fit doesn't really occur in the same way as Williams and Tóth presents it. So while they seem to think that the fit is necessary and necessarily perfect, I think for Aristotle and the medieval Aristotelians, there are cases where it fails. So for instance, I mean, this is a sort of weird Aristotelian biology, but of course the sun has the power by which it multiplies light through the medium, through the air. So that's the proper effect of the sun. But the sun also, according to Aristotle, virtually contains all the living powers of the animals. So for instance, it concurs whenever a human is generated, it has to concur. Whenever a fly is generated, actually, the sun is the sole cause of its generation. So that means that sometimes agents can act on things that cannot receive its causal power perfectly. And so in this case, they say that the cause sort of virtually contains the effect. There are also cases in the other direction. So for instance, they would say that the elements, the four elements, water, earth, water, air, fire, virtually contain all the mixtures that can be brought about from them. So these are cases where somehow there is a discrepancy or a mismatch between the cause's active power and the effects or the patient's passive power. And I think these cases are interesting, and I still think it makes the problem of fit a little bit less acute for most medieval thinkers. But unfortunately, of course, it doesn't apply everywhere. So I mean, what I want to look at now is what to do with cases where it doesn't apply. So basically, I want to argue that theology may offer a way for dealing with this problem. I have to warn, though, the people here about basically two warnings. So first of all, as you have probably noticed already, this is very much a work in progress. So I'm not going to offer a sort of final solution or anything like that. And I mean, the major problem is that the solution will be somewhat disappointing, I think, at least. So, but let's get to it. So I think before turning to teleology proper, it's worth to pause for a second to see what active and passive powers are. I mean, I've been talking about them quite a bit already, but just sort of to remind ourselves of the main framework we are working with. Of course, the main framework is Aristotle, and according to Aristotle, you know, the intro to Aristotle 101 account, ordinary objects are metaphysically composite. They consist of matter and form. And as we know, form in general is an active principle, while matter in general is a passive principle. Now, so this is the generic account, and I don't think it's particularly helpful at this point. So I think one question to consider here is what accounts for a thing's active and passive powers exactly. So I think active powers are the easier part here because as I already said, and as we all know, forms are the active principles. And so of course they also account for the active powers of things. Now, I think it would be tempted to say that matter accounts for passive powers, but unfortunately that cannot be the case because matter as such in our framework is purely passive and featureless, and so it cannot really account for anything in this sense. And there was a paper published pretty recently by Gloria Frost, which I think is really interesting. And it basically argues that, look, we have to consider the problem a little bit in more detail here, because as we also probably all know, matter for Aristotle is not a univocal term, and it's not a univocal term for the medievals either. So there is what we call proximate matter or specific matter, and there is what we call prime matter. So prime matter is the completely featureless, according to at least some authors, pure potency. But proximate matter is not that. So proximate matter is really what basically what the substantial form of the thing requires to sort of in order to inform. So for instance, if you consider a cat, then its proximate matter is the organic stuff that cats are made out of, or that they consist of. So anyway, we don't really need to waste, I think, more time on this, but I think Frost has made a very convincing case that passive powers, at least for Aquinas, and I think for most, probably most 13th and at least some 14th century thinkers, passive powers are really grounded in proximate matter. So, well, how can we understand this? So again, consider a cat. Its proximate matter is the organic stuff that cats consist of, the biological cells or whatever. And there was, of course, a lot of disagreement about how to conceive of this proximate matter and how to understand like how proximate it has to be. But I don't think that's very relevant for us now. What is important is that on this picture, proximate matter sort of stands between prime matter and the whole substance. And I think that given that the fit between active and passive powers is analogous to the fit between proximate matter and substantial form, we can think about that fit sort of in terms of this letter fit. So if we try to translate the problem of fit to substantial form and proximate matter, then we basically end up with the question that what is it that makes it the case that the proximate matter is always such that it fits a given substantial form? And I think the question put in this way is a little strange. And I mean, I hope everyone finds it a little strange, because of course, proximate matter and form are not ontologically independent things, right? I mean, proximate matter sort of depends both, I think, conceptually, but also ontologically on the substantial form, and in some way vice versa. So it cannot be really meaningfully asked what makes them fit together. And I think a similar case can be made about active and passive powers as well. So again, Frost has argued that active and passive powers constitute a single potency. So basically, passive powers have the same number as their active counterparts and are also individuated by their corresponding actualities. So basically, what takes place when a fire heats up some water is just one process, right? I mean, it's one heating process. And so asking why two ontologically independent things happen to fit together is not really the right question to ask in this case. So, and really, according to this picture, at least, so active and passive powers fit together just as form and matter fit together, because they are teleologically oriented to one another. And I think Aristotle illustrates this point. So this is from the Physics. He said that for teeth and all other natural things, either invariably or for the most part come about in a given way, but of not one of the results of chance, of spontaneity, is this true. I leave out a few lines. So if then it is agreed that things are either the result of coincidence or for the sake of something, and these cannot be the result of coincidence or spontaneity, it follows that they, sorry, typo, must be for the sake of something. Therefore, the action for an end is present in things which come to be and are by nature. So it seems to be that for Aristotle and for most medievals as well, really this sort of inherent teleological nature of active and passive powers being ordained for the same action are sort of the solution to this problem. Now, this seems all fine and dandy. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more problematic. And the problem is really what I referred to at the very beginning of the paper here. So there was a considerable disagreement about how to conceive final causes. And the problem originates for this conviction that a cause, if we are talking about causes, then we are talking about things that give being to other things. And of course, this is obviously true of efficient causes that really make other things or make things happen. And it's also arguably obvious for the case of material causes and formal causes. But of course, the question is, how does this work for final causes? Now, unfortunately, it is problematic, right? Because how can something give being if it doesn't exist? So if you think that the final cause of the builder or the house building process is the existing house, right? Aristotle gives the example that the final cause of the house building is to give shelter. Now, if the shelter doesn't exist yet, then how can it give being to the process of house building? So there were by and large two strategies to deal with this problem, at least in the medieval period. And I'm not really, I mean, it would really be, I think we need to write, someone, not me, someone needs to write a book about the history of final causes in the Middle Ages. It doesn't exist yet. But at least according to the mainstream solution, which is Avicenna's solution, arguably Aquinas' solution, is to say that a final cause can play a role only insofar as some agent is thinking about it. So it is really, a final cause is really an end as existing intentionally, which is the cause. So Bob Pasnau calls it the forward-looking account because it attempts to give explanations of things in terms of other things that have not come to be about yet, and perhaps never will. But there is an agent that intends to bring them about. And so, of course, if you have the intention is an existing thing, so you don't run into the above mentioned difficulty about non-existing things giving rise to existing things. Now, there was another strategy. Anyway, I just want to mention it very quickly. So that's arguably Occam's way out of the problem, to say that, you know what, final causes are not really causes. They are only causes, metaphorically speaking. And so let's just forget about this. So if we stick with this sort of the mainstream view, this forward-looking account, I mean, it's very important to keep in mind that teleology then seems to be grounded in intention. And of course, the question is, well, what kind of intention can we talk about when we look at, for instance, the active and passive powers of a fire or something like that? Now, of course, as far as Aristotle is concerned, I think it is quite clear from his argument for the first mover and the subsequent characterization, especially in the Metaphysics, that he thinks of the first mover as the ultimate ground of the well-ordered nature of the universe. And I think, I mean, it's not a coincidence that the first mover moves as a final cause, right? It's very important in Aristotle, and orders everything as an ultimate end and object of love and desire. And in the Meteorology, especially, I should have put that quote here, but I didn't. Aristotle says that we must assign causality in the sense of the originating principle of motion to the power of the eternally moving bodies. Okay, Aquinas would agree, of course. He says that, this is from the Fifth Way. I mean, it's a very famous passage. Those things, however, that do not have cognition do not tend towards an end unless directed by another knowing and intelligent agent, just as the arrow is directed by the archer. Therefore, there is something intelligent by which all natural things are ordained to the end, and we call this God. I think maybe the De Veritate passage is more interesting, but it's basically the same idea. For it is necessary that everything that naturally tends towards something else had this direction from something else, directing it to the end. Otherwise, it would tend toward it by chance. Now in natural things, we find the natural appetite by which each thing tends towards its own end. And from this, it follows that we have to posit above all things some intellect which ordain natural things to their ends and endow them with their natural inclination. So what can we learn from this? I think what we can learn from it is that in these passages, it seems that in natural things that are end-directed, they are not self-explanatory, and especially not explanatory within sort of the natural universe. And both Aristotle and Aquinas seems to think that teleology must be grounded in some intentional agent. And for Aristotle, that's arguably the prime mover, and he also has a whole lot of heavenly bodies to sort of help him out in this. He also argues that the motion of the heavenly bodies are both efficient and final causes of the order of the universe here below. So I want to wrap this up here. I think, so I explored in this paper a few ways that were open to medieval authors to solve this problem of fit. Again, according to this problem, it is a surprising fact that active and passive powers fit together, and so it's metaphysically speaking very implausible. So as I showed, the medieval authors conceived of these powers quite differently than some contemporary Aristotelians. They thought of active and passive powers as not ontologically independent entities, and consequently they thought that they are teleologically oriented towards both towards each other and especially towards the action to which they produce. But unfortunately, to make sense of this teleology, again, Aristotle and medieval thinkers referred to the first mover or God. And I said unfortunately because I think you may think that from the contemporary metaphysical point of view, this is not a very plausible solution. Of course, we tend to, and I think there is a tendency, which I think is somewhat unfortunate, to sort of read Aristotle and especially the medievals sort of stripped from these, both from the cosmological and from the theological framework. And I think you can't really, I mean, at least as this paper tries to show, you can't really do that because even sort of these worldly notions like active and passive powers presuppose some kind of cosmology and theology, not just teleology. Okay, but so what can you do if you don't want to do that? So I think you can endorse the whole baggage. Brian Cotter has an interesting forthcoming paper. He does philosophy of religion primarily, but he argues that the fact that the laws of the universe and the initial states of the universe fit is really surprising fact. And so that's, I mean, he basically runs some kind of a design argument from that. So I think you can do that. I mean, if you don't find that very appealing, then you may think that, well, let's just endorse teleology as a brute fact, maybe just not look for what grounds it. I think if you do that, I mean, the main, basically the main Aristotelian conviction that you have to give up then is that causation is univocal. So you will have to say basically what Occam says, that okay, maybe final causes are not causes in the same sense as efficient causes are causes. So they are not different species of the same genus. They are completely different kinds of explanations. And I think, I mean, the price of that, of course, is that it's very difficult to make sense of final causation in that case, because of course we have a pretty good intuitive grasp about what efficient causes are. But if we give up the univocal notion of causes, then it's a little bit harder to see what final causes might be. So I think these are really the strategies here that we can take. And I think it's also interesting that, of course, the causal powers and the like became under attack in the early modern period for the first time, really, or at least seriously under attack in the early modern period. Of course, when all this, both the theological and the cosmological framework got questioned. So I think that's probably not a coincidence. And well, just sort of as a final final pessimistic note, if this wasn't pessimistic enough, is that, of course, I mean, even if you endorse sort of the whole baggage, I think one worry is that you relegate teleology as sort of into the role of a gap filler, right? And I think that's arguably what Aristotle does. That's arguably what medieval authors, or at least most of them, do. To sort of, you really start with the sort of atomic features of the natural world, and whenever you can give a sufficient explanation, then you refer to God or to the motion of the heavenly bodies or something like that. And I think if you have independent grounds to posit those things, and of course medieval authors did have independent grounds to posit the existence of God or the existence of the heavenly bodies, that's not really a deal breaker. But if this is your only reason to invoke teleology into the picture, then that may be a problem. All right, so I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.